In this lesson, we're going to learn how to use the inverted shading method to shade our characters. This is actually a mode that we have already seen partially in the previous video, but we will now look at it in more detail to explore its possibilities and understand how we can use it as a complete shading method, or to complement our standard shading work. The inverted shading method involves working in the opposite way to the basic shading method. Instead of adding shadows to an empty layer, we darken the entire silhouette of our drawing, and then we cut out geometric shapes using the lasso tool, thus creating illuminated areas that stand out against a mostly darkened background. To achieve this effect, we're going to use a technique very similar to the one we used to block in the base color of our figure during the coloring stage. The first thing we need to do is create a new layer for our shadows, which we can name whatever we want. Now, we can select the Fill tool, the paint bucket, and choose the Enclose and Fill option in the Subtool panel. Remember, this panel is located at the top on the right. Then, all you need to do is click anywhere on the canvas outside our drawing and trace a circle that includes it inside. When you release the mouse, the program will automatically color in the entire silhouette of our character. The next step is to change the layers blending mode to multiply, just as we did in the previous lesson, and in this case too. We can adjust the opacity to taste to obtain the shading intensity that we want. Let's assume the light source is located exactly where it was before, above the character slightly off to the right. In this case, the illuminated areas will be the same as before. The planes of the head that are oriented in the opposite direction to the light, that is, the planes oriented upwards and towards the right. Remember that you can use the reference we prepared earlier as help. Once we've located the planes we want to illuminate, we'll select our lasso tool from the Selection tool panel and start cutting out geometric shapes trying to follow the volume of the planes we want to illuminate. For example, let's start with the fisherman's hat. If the light is coming from above and to the right, we should illuminate this part here approximately. As with the basic shading process, these initial cuts should be considered as a first approximation to shading, so don't worry if they're not entirely accurate or if you need to refine them later. To do this, you can use the pen tool to retrieve shaded areas or the eraser tool to expand them. You can also use the Auto Select tool to directly cut out areas that are defined by the ink lines. For example, this small triangle here represents torn fabric from the hat that bends outward, so perhaps it would look good to illuminate it. To do this, just auto-select the whole area of the triangle and press Ctrl X. These are the basic techniques you'll need for inverted shading. As you can see, it's a technically quite simple process. What I'm doing here is just going around the character using the same tools over and over again. The lasso tool, the fill tool to recover these areas, the lasso tool again, and here I will create a more complex shape trying to illuminate this whole area at once. Something like this, just as a first approach, but actually I kind of like it. Just let me fix the socket of the eye here with the pen tool. And now I'll use the eraser tool to clean that corner down there. Now it looks more sharp. I like it like that. I create another triangular shape below the eye and then the nose. Again, something quite rough, not very precise, but I like it like that. Another shape here to add some volume to the hair. Let's expand this area a little bit. And now I use the Auto Select tool to clear that small area up there. And as you can see, it's basically the same over and over again. Lasso tool and then refine with the pen and the eraser tool. It's not that difficult. As you progress, you'll realize that the end result will likely be darker than that of basic shading. That is, Working with inverted shading, we leave more surface darkened than with basic shading. This is perfectly acceptable and can be used as an expressive resource as long as we are aware of the effect we're going to create. Inverted shading is especially useful for illuminating characters in night scenes, in sinister environments, or when they are backlit. That's when the light source is located behind them. On these occasions, it is possible to illuminate the character exclusively using this style of shading. However, in most cases, I tend to use both shadings in a complementary way. Generally, I use basic shading most of the time, but I often use the inverted shading technique when I need to illuminate parts of the character that are very darkened, such as the inside of a cape, for example. As you can see in the real-time example in this lesson's video, it's a fairly simple shading process, so you can also consider it if you need to save time and don't need too precise shading. It's a shading mode that offers many possibilities. When you're done, you'll get something similar to this. What do you think? Let's compare it with our previous example, in basic shading. There's quite a difference, isn't there? The same base drawing with the same colors acquires a very different tone depending on the type of shading we use. So I encourage you to experiment with both methods to find out which method fits your style best. Before finishing, I'll show you something I discovered accidentally that you may like. If you've completed this lesson and the previous one, you probably now have two shading layers: the basic shading from the previous lesson and the inverted shading we've just created. Let's see what happens if we activate both at the same time. Do you like it? Activating both shading layers creates an additional plane of shadows: dark, intermediate, and highlighted. This makes the drawing gain chromatic richness and complexity. In a way, the drawing seems more elaborate, we could say. This, for me, is a problem. As you know, I prefer simplicity, expressiveness over complexity. Personally, I believe that adding more shades of shading takes us away from this stylistic simplicity and dangerously close to this no man's land, halfway between complex and stylized, which personally I find unconvincing. Therefore, in the vast majority of cases, I work with only two shades of shading, not three: that of the shadow layer and that of the original layer with the flat colors, which remains uncovered. However, I invite you to try how well this double shading technique combines with your artistic style. Remember, as always, you can adjust the opacity and hue of the shadow layers with the opacity sliders or by pressing Ctrl U,